Swartz here from Sales for Nerds, kicking off the Sales for Nerds podcast. If you feel more comfortable with SQL than sales calls, more at home writing test suites than proposals, more interested in crunching numbers than shaking hands, if you think networking should be about routers rather than cocktails with strangers, if you're more interested in debating code editors than negotiating deals, but somehow you ended up responsible for some of those sales and marketing activities, this is the podcast for you. Today, I'm super excited to have Marylou Tyler join Sales for Nerds. She started out as a systems engineer writing operating system software. So again, we're really pulling in some fantastic nerds. And she has gone from there to being, along with Aaron Ross, the co-author of Predictable Revenue. And if you haven't read this book, you need to go read it right now. Really important. And she's got a new book out called Predictable Prospecting. So yeah. Marylou, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
And what do you have in your glass, since I couldn't bring any wine to you?
I have a Pinot Noir from a winery called Lost Hills. I'm not exactly sure where they are. Sorry, Lost Angel.
Okay.
And I'm not exactly sure I know they're California, but I'm not sure if they're down in Paso Robles area or if they're further up in Napa area. So I'll have to get back to you on that.
All right. Yeah, we've got to get some kind of link in the show notes or something, so if people like it, they can track it down. I've got this Chateau de Grisel from France.
Wow.
It sounds super fancy. It's really not. It's like $8 at Costco, and it's fantastic. So, but you sound very sophisticated whenever you say Chateau de something or other.
Yes.
And so I was using this to cook for dinner last night, and it's a Malbec Merlot blend, which is not a typical French blend, but I like it. So,
and I have in this glass is the Pinot that we just talked about. Plus, there's a local Des Moines, Iowa. I don't know what his title is, mixologist that has created a secret sangria recipe just for this broadcast. So I have a special website you guys can go to make the sangria portion, and you pour it in with the Pinot, and it's excellent. So
all right, this
just
is exciting.
For you guys.
we are taking this podcast up a notch or two. We've got our own drink for this episode. I love it.
Your own drink. It's got your name on it, and it's a secret page that has the recipe. So, yeah.
So Marylou,
just for you.
I don't want to go all the way back to the beginning too much, but how did you get from writing operating systems code to writing books about sales? You don't have to go through every last step, but that's a pretty interesting journey that I think most of us are not qualified to write operating systems code, and we feel like we can't sell. It's like, why can't I make it across this small gap? Marylou's gone across this entire canyon.
Yeah, I started school and always was interested in computers, software engineering specifically, not the hardware side. So I'm not a hardware fan, but software definitely. And I was in the unique position where I can translate from the clients what they needed into the programming languages that we needed to do it with. So I was always put in a client-facing liaison role because I had the gift of speaking, but also I could translate what they were saying into the actual programming that needed to get done. So I was just really good writing technical documents. I've always been really good about putting together the design specifications. Long story short, I became a systems engineer. I was helping the sales teams figure out disruptive types of solutions because at the time we were moving from analog to digital, so there was a lot of disruption going on. One day I came into the office and my boss pretty much waved a magic wand over our head and said, "Okay, all you systems engineers are now salespeople. We fired all the salespeople." So that's how I got into sales.
Okay, that's really interesting. And what did you do? Were you like, okay, no problem, I got this?
No, I was freaking out because I'm an introvert at heart. I solve problems. I'm a consultant. Mm-hmm. I try to figure out the puzzle pieces, and I wasn't sure how that knowledge and that way of doing business translated into sales, because I always thought salespeople were charismatic. They could, basically take any conversation and convince you to, the whole selling ice to Eskimos thing. I really thought salespeople were like that. So I was terrified about being put in that position. But, I had a livelihood. I had a daughter to take care of. I was a single parent. So it's like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. Luckily, I had my process background and I looked to see the tasks in sales that looked repeatable, looked like we can make them scalable, and looked like they were process driven. So I applied the know-how of process to the sales pipeline, and that's how I survived.
And at this time, was there a process or a CRM or whatever company-wide, or were you kind of doing this yourself?
No, we didn't have client server technology wasn't even available yet. So we had, oh gosh, a database package. Probably, I can't even, we didn't even have relational databases yet. We had hierarchical databases. So, there was, I can't even think of the names of them, but there were a few databases here and there that we could use. But we had to pretty much piece it together ourselves. There was no Salesforce. There wasn't even an Act yet or any of those other ones. So basically, we started with, PL1, C++ was around. So we created systems and processes and touch points, and we were using direct mail and phone at the time. There wasn't even email yet. So we put this all together and created a process that allowed us to sell into very high-end accounts. I had 6 accounts that I sold into, and that was it. And I had a $2 million quota way back when in the 1980s. And I was able to utilize my processing know-how to reach out to these people in a systematic way so that I could convert them into clients. And
so what specifics of that process, or if you remember back that far, what were some of the things that you say, hey, I can turn this into a process? Because I think everyone says, gosh, I'd love to have a process. If I only had a process that worked, I'd be, if not done, at least I would have some foundation to build on.
Yeah. Basically, if you go back to your programming roots, anything that you do more than once consistently is viable for process. If you look at it that way, if it's a unique step that you do every once in a while, then okay, maybe that doesn't go into a process. But if you are working on something where you do the same types of rhythms over and over again, they are definitely candidates for process. Now, there's going to be a plus or minus percentage of gap in there, but for the most part, you could create what I call the superhighway and get that in place, and then make sure you're measuring both intra and interstage the performance of that particular spot in the pipeline you're working on. And that's where my background in analytics just was a lifesaver, a stress reducer for me, because I was able to not worry about the stress around selling, but let the data tell me the path to go.
Right. And I think that's an important point that's come up a couple of times on this podcast, where if you have a process and you sort of have that engineering background, when the process fails, you go fix the process, just like you would if your program failed. You don't have to take it so personally.
Exactly. And you look at it like a heat map. You look at the overall system and you look for those pulsating red areas that help me, that you need to work on. And you just concentrate on that one area, get it working, get it fine-tuned, and then move on to the next. You don't try to tackle the whole thing at once. That's what makes you crazy, is trying to figure out the whole thing at once. But if you look at one area and start incrementally improving, and I am a fan of the lean methodology, the DMAIC approach. So I take one area and focus on that, let the data tell me what path to take, A/B split test, and then go.
Okay. So just the same way you would, if the problem was you have a program that has various things that aren't working or need improvement, you don't try to fix them all at once. You figure it out and you put it together. And I think there's a certain mindset of people that have no problem with that, but would be totally freaked out by the sales problem. And vice versa, right? Some of the people who have the gift of gab, or they're more extroverted, if you ask them to fix a program, they would get flustered. But really, it's the same thing. Is that fair?
It is. And I think we have an advantage from the sense that we have the overall architecture in mind, because we want to have a viable solution. That's how our brains think. So we're more apt to look at the thing holistically and break it down into the parts, and then use our math background to say, what can I fix that's easy, that's going to have the highest impact for me? And we have a natural way of prioritizing what we need to do. So it just takes that whole stress off our shoulders, because we don't just see this huge thing that just paralyzes us. Instead, we break it down to the parts and look at where things are functioning well, the good, better, best type of matrix, and we tackle in order. So we're a lot more strategic in that sense.
So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that some of our listeners may not have a process laid out in enough rigor. What might a process look like? It doesn't have to cover everyone, but just for the people who are saying, gosh, yes, I'd love to have a process, but I don't even know where to start. Where should they begin?
Well, I specialize in top of funnel. So I'm specializing from the initial first conversation or follow-up conversation all the way through to where you think you've got a viable opportunity. So there are logical breakdowns in that conversation. If you think about it, you're going to have the initial conversation. There's a pre-conversation to get to the initial conversation. Then somewhere along the way, you're going to say, hey, are we a good fit for one another? Are we good to work together? So that's like another milestone. And then after that, once you start building that rapport with this person, you're going to say, does he qualify for what I need to go the rest of the way? Those are all logical paths where you're going to basically make a go, no-go decision. So if you think of your pipeline as intelligent stages where you're making this go, no-go decision, you'll have mapped out your success path from that initial conversation to closed one. But you're also going to have this pre-conversation now going on because we have technology to help us bubble up those folks to the top and warm up that chill for us so that we can have that initial conversation.
And I think something that I believe you're saying that's really powerful is if we have this almost like a state machine of here's where people are in the conversation, the client obviously has veto power over advancing to the next state or the prospect. Right. But so do we. And I think all too often we cede 100% of the power to the prospect. And then we don't necessarily know what state someone's in because we haven't properly determined. So if somebody proactively forces us to sell to them, they can make it all the way through this funnel. But if not, they can kind of hang out in the middle because we haven't decided what to do with them. And forcing yourself to have those clear entry and exit points, we can decide. We can't force the prospect to do anything against their wishes, but we can have our wishes be part of the pipeline as well.
Yeah, and if you think of it as a freeway, there are mile markers along the freeway that we all that resonates with us. What we don't want to do is spin our wheels at a certain mile marker and get stuck there. We want to be able to progress either forward to the next mile marker or we want to go out of the active freeway and exit. It's perfectly okay to exit because we've learned that they're not a good fit for us. Right. And we're all about quality. So we want to really help those people who are not a good fit to exit out as much as we can. And then get the people to move forward, even if it's an inch forward to the next mile marker. Every conversation we have that's meaningful, we want to learn something new and move an inch forward or move out. What we don't want to do is get stuck in the spinning the wheels at the same mile marker. Yeah.
And I know from personal experience, making that mental switch to having some control over your pipeline sometimes seems a little scary. And one of the things that I realized that helped me a lot was realizing that for the prospect, they're in the same boat. They don't want to spin their wheels either. If it's not going to be a good fit, they want out too before they waste too much time. And if it's a good fit, they want to move forward.
Right.
And they may get off later, but they're not talking to you because they don't have enough to do.
Exactly. And you have to really feel in your heart of hearts that what you're providing is of value to them and that you're going to transform their life. If you, in a conversation, are not feeling that, then they're not a good fit. Right. Just know that. If you feel that you are able to transform the way that they're doing their business or help them move maybe a promotion or whatever it is that you're doing, you've got to have that feeling on every call. That's a mindset change that we have to know that we are a peer of theirs. We're guiding them. We're taking their hand literally and gently pulling them through this pipeline to get them to the happily ever after. Right. That's really what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. So after you jumped into sales and you were thrown into the river and apparently you swam and you didn't drown, which is great. What happened next?
Well, what happened next was I became an expert in top of funnel because as an engineer, I niched naturally to one area of the pipeline that I wanted to master, and I wanted to really understand from the deep levels. It's like the the root cause, right, that we are all taught in college. I really wanted to get down to the nitty gritty, the inch wide, mile deep of lead generation.
Okay.
So I continued focusing really on pre-sales conversation, initial conversation through to qualified opportunity. If you ask me about what happens after the opportunity to close, my eyes glaze over. It's not my area of expertise. So I stayed there and I became known as that expert. I was called in by a number of companies to help them, Bose and MasterCard, UPS, Apple. I worked with the larger companies at the time to help them with their lead gen systems. And then somewhere along the line, I started working with the internet, and I realized my background in telephony, direct mail, I didn't really have the email engine background. So I was so fortunate. I was listening to a webinar with a gentleman on the webinar by the name of Aaron Ross. And that's how I found him. I immediately reached out to him because that's what we do. We reach out to people we don't know to try to start a conversation. And I said, I want whatever you're doing. I want to understand what you're doing because it sounds like predictive dialing for the telephony side, but it's email. So we ended up hooking up, and it culminated in the 2011 release of Predictable Revenue.
Okay. And that's fantastic. And I know I said I didn't want to belabor this story, but I think it's really interesting because you went from I'm writing code, we fired the sales team, I'm selling stuff, and now I'm working with MasterCard and Apple and Bose. And I feel like maybe it would be helpful to lay up just a couple of stepping stones for people. How did you go from one place to another?
Well, it was strictly because I started and in the programming side, and then I actually, for these other companies, for MasterCard, for Bose, for Apple, I actually developed what we called a direct response information system. So I wrote the code pre-Salesforce, pre-Marketo, pre-Pardot to do what these systems do now. And I did it in a client server background. There was no cloud at the time.
Right.
And so because I wrote the code and had to explain the code to clients, I started getting a lot more client facing. And because of that, I enjoyed having conversation with clients. And it was a natural for me to then move from development, which was operating system, then I moved to application, and I moved to GUI interfaces. And then the next step was actually talking to a body.
Right.
So that's how my progression had happened is I started going into more client facing, and I became an analyst, and then I became a consultant, and now I'm a mentor.
It's so funny, and there's a lot of echoes in my journey there. I was the guy writing the code in the Birkenstocks, never talking to customers.
Yeah.
And you got pulled in for sales meetings to answer the technical questions. And after a while, I realized that the coding was actually the easy part. The hard part was the people and the organization and the training and the strategy, and it all had to go together. And that's kind of how I got sucked in. It was completely accidental. So thanks for filling that in. I think that makes a lot of sense. How did you decide to focus on that beginning of the funnel? Because I think a lot of people would say, okay, you're introverted, you're an engineer, you're going to come in and get into the nitty gritty. You're not going to be doing the outreach with the really broad top of the funnel and people you've never talked to. How did you decide to focus there?
You teach what you need to learn.
Okay.
It's really as simple as that. It stymied me for so long, and I just really wanted to be able to master it. So I focused my effort in the area that I felt I was lacking in skill. It's as simple as that. And I ended up spending now close to 30 years in that side of the funnel, and can't even imagine doing anything but that.
So were there breakthrough moments, were there light bulb moments, or were there things that you look back and you say, gosh, that was a really important thing for me to learn?
Most definitely. If I could point to one thing that transformed me, it's learning copywriting, learning persuasive copywriting. I have in my office here the books from all the greats from the 60s, the advertising giants. I'm enrolled currently in 5 copywriting classes. So that is one area that I know transformed the way I can help clients and also my results, because the ability to have those conversations in a way that's persuasive yet impactful and moving and with a sense of urgency only comes from studying writing.
And I guess we should say, don't expect that you're going to be immediately done with that stage because you've been at this for 30 years and you're currently in 5 classes.
Yeah, exactly. I have one programming class right now because I still have to dabble in programming because that's how it's almost like, my innate nature as a programmer. So I'm a market research analyst, so I still program a lot, but I don't study programming languages. I study writing for sure.
If someone's going to start with one book about copywriting, where should they start?
I would read Breakthrough Advertising by Eugene Schwartz. I would read the Scientific Advertising, which is on the internet. I think you can actually download the PDF file. Scientific advertising is great for us because it's all about the data. Mm-hmm. And because you have the data, that gives you, when you're armed with data, you have that sense of confidence that you can try things and compare it against a benchmark. Right. So scientific advertising gives you all those benchmarks to give you permission to go out and try things when it comes to writing.
That makes a lot of sense. And then in terms of the actual writing itself, does I've never read Scientific Advertising. Does it go into that?
It goes into study of the direct mail. It's mostly direct mail based, and it talks about the headlines and it talks about the testing. So the testing and the conversion rate optimization pieces, which is what I, as a engineer, really gravitate towards, gives you enough to say, okay, there's a structure. There is a process even in how you create an email. Mm-hmm. And so in my new book, Predictable Prospecting, I've created a framework for writing an email. Why? Because I was able to see that there are constructs that you need to have in every email, whether it's 80 words or 480 words, in order to be able to get someone excited about moving down that pipeline with you. So scientific advertising gave me that idea that it's definitely blocks of intelligence that are in a letter or in an email. And my engineering mind was able to connect those to say, okay, we need to have these pieces. So let's try to figure out how to maximize each piece. Like we're always trying to do is improve the performance of whatever engine we're working on. So it gave me that really permission to say, okay, I'm going to work on the subject line, or I'm going to work on that first line, or whatever it is. And since I was looking at it that way, it took all the stress off, what word do I need to use, or how do I say this? I never had that issue.
So you just run an experiment, and the experiment will tell you.
Yes, exactly. And because we know the margin of error, we know statistical analytics, we understand sampling theory, we know how many of these emails we need to send before we have a statistically relevant sample so that we can say, okay, we're going to make a change to the subject line, or okay, we're going to make a change to the click-through. So it's very logical, and that's what I love about it. It's very logical. Top of funnel. When you get from opportunity to close, then it's like being married and you have the family coming in. You have all these little nuances that we don't necessarily have at top of funnel, because top of funnel is really math in a lot of ways.
That's a great point, and something I had not considered before, and it makes sense now why you're top of funnel and why, I think I spend probably more time than I would have thought based on my personality type, because I'm introverted as well, at the top of the funnel. And you're right, it's because you can use numbers. Yes. And averages and so on. And
we're working with a lot more records at top of funnel. So you have to look at it that way. And it is a funnel. We start out with a lot more records, and we're disqualifying right and left until we get to a statistically relevant number that we can take to close. But then when we take to close, we have a finite number of things. So we have to really be more concerned about the psychological and behavioral nuances than we would normally do at top of funnel.
Okay. And just to really briefly recap for people who have not yet read Predictable Revenue, the breakthrough idea for me was, hey, there are different stages in the funnel, and there's different skill sets that are going to succeed at those different stages. And if you try to make one person do the whole thing, it's going to be a mess. Go ahead. I might not have summarized it correctly.
No, you did. But the reality is I am teaching a class right now, and 48% of my students are still doing all roles. So the ideal nirvana is separating the roles, but it's still not prevalent in a lot of companies.
In a lot of companies, even though some of the ones that do it, sometimes they do it badly and so on. But I think even if you have one person doing it, the notion that it's almost like a different project. to do the prospecting and the opportunities and so on. I imagine that's even super helpful, even if you do have one person doing the whole pipeline.
Yeah, it's the sooner you can separate roles, the better, because there are personality traits for each of those segments of the pipeline, and they do map to certain behavioral aspects. Like I'm better at top of funnel than I would be mid or even bottom of funnel. I just know that as me as a person. I love everybody. I want everybody to be a part of, my family. And you can't do that when you get further into the pipeline. You have to weed out the people who are going to be not a good fit for you, for sure. Otherwise, you're maintaining and your servicing is going to be a nightmare if you have clients that are not a good fit.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was curious about is when you sort of draw the barriers or the stepping stones or whatever you want to refer to it as in your pipeline, kind of when does prospecting end? And is prospecting a sales activity or a marketing activity? I've heard it referred to as part of both or either department.
I think in the larger companies, there is a definite demarc between marketing with the call to action, or the end result is a marketing qualified lead, or an MQL, they call it. And that is basically driven by the upper levels of awareness there are 5 levels of awareness of people who are coming into your world. So marketing is generally the interested people because they've done a search, they know about you, they fill out a form, they're aware that you provide a solution for a problem they have.
Okay.
And that's marketing. So that ends with an MQL, but we get minnows and we get whales, right? We don't know what we're getting because people are kicking the tires and coming in. Predictable revenue is all about the whales. It's all about we decide who it is that we want to have a conversation with, but we don't know where they are in their level of awareness either.
Okay. So
that's usually a sales function because we're actually targeting people that we want to talk to that are going to be high probability of closing. I'm sure you may remember this matrix. High revenue potential, high probability of closing. That goes in a special sales list or queue, and that's marketed to generally by sales, typically.
Okay.
So we have 2 different lead types. We're really working the whales. The inbound MQLs could be minnows or whales.
So if you're setting up your process, it sounds like the first thing you want to do is figure out what constitutes a minnow or a whale.
Yes. That is the most important thing that we brushed on in predictable revenue, that predictable prospecting drills you guys ad nauseum into, because I saw that when I was working out in the field that people weren't doing this. They weren't understanding their ideal account profile, narrowing that niche to those high probability accounts that are going to close faster, higher revenue, and higher close ratios. And then from there, predictable prospecting talks to you about, okay, now that you have those accounts, what about the people in those accounts? Because we want to be able to market to them, meaning send our sequences, our emails, our voicemails to a specific persona and talk the language that they're used to talking. Predictable revenue never covered any of that.
Okay. So start with who's the person we're ideally selling to, or the company that we're ideally selling to, and what are the people in there who have to do the buying? Is that a fair summary?
It's who are the people that we're going to meet along the way on that pipeline, because the people you meet pre-conversation or first conversation may not be the people who you end up talking to, right? But they may be those internal referrals, those people that will give you an idea of the initiatives at the company. They might help you get in the door, because top of funnel, we're trying to get that foot in the door, and start that first conversation and get that first meeting. So these people may be different than when you get to opportunity. So we define who those people are, positionally where we think we're going to meet them at the pipeline, and then set up our dialogues and conversations so that we engage them and give them the sense of urgency that talking to us is the best thing that they could possibly do.
And so that relies on us knowing what they actually care about.
Yes.
At a very fundamental level.
Yes, exactly. And chapter 3 of the new book outlines all the things you need to worry about when it comes to personas for sales. It's not marketing. Marketing personas are very different from the personas that we need. Why? Because the call to action or the end result of a marketing persona is the qualified lead. The end result of our conversation with the persona is the first meeting, the booking of that meeting. Very different needs.
Okay. So, assuming we have our pipeline laid out and we kind of have the entry and exit points, are you saying that we're going to have 2 pipelines, one for marketing and one for this predictable prospecting?
I think where they meet is, if I were to draw the pipeline on a napkin, I would have a cold queue, which is our targeted list of people, the whales that we're going after. Once we figure out who they are, they move to a working status, and that's where the marketing qualified leads also come in, as well as trade show leads, as well as executive briefing leads. It's the ones where you kind of know the right person. They start in the working status, but the cold status are those people that we've selected and targeted that we want to go after, that we're not quite sure yet if they're the right person that we have, or we don't know as much about them as we would from them coming inbound to us.
So it's almost like you have your inbound queue, which is whomever shows up attracted by your marketing. And then you have your outbound queue, which is we've pre-identified these folks are like at the top of the pyramid. We are going to go after them.
Yes, and they're sourced differently so that you, as the executive decision maker, can decide, okay, if I only have 20 accounts I can work today, in what order do I want to work them? If you know the source, that'll help you decide if you're working the minnows versus the whales.
Okay, and so then you need some way you've already predetermined that the folks in the outbound queue are whales, right? They may not all close, but you know that they're qualified by certain metrics. That's how they got on the list. And then you could apply those same metrics to your inbound queue if you wanted to.
Yes.
So you can move people. Okay.
Perfect.
I'm catching on slowly here. I need a napkin, I think.
Yeah, it's all about, we have only so much time, and so we've defined who our ideal folks are, and if we are lucky to have them come in through referrals or inbound, we still want to run them through some kind of process to say, are they worthy of my time to chase them?
Right.
Yes or no. If they're not, I still want to talk to them, but I may let automation talk to them first, as opposed to me, the human, talking to them. So you can hear in my voice that we're segmenting all the time, leveraging technology versus people to decide with these hours in my day how I should talk to people and who I should talk to in priority order. Very math oriented, right?
Right. When it's almost like it reminds me of your operating system days, right? It's like there's a queue and which threads get to execute. You don't want the garbage process chewing up the whole CPU, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah. Yes.
So you mentioned earlier that there are, there's a known scientific structure to emails. And I'm sure most people are saying, gosh, I get so many emails and 99% of them suck. And every once in a while you get one, you're like, hey, that's actually a good email. But I don't know scientifically what makes it good. So what makes a good email?
It's, for us, a top of funnel. If you study the hero's journey, which is like your favorite movies all follow the hero's journey. And there are basically 5 little buckets that you can put the story into, and that's what the email has to go. There's some type of trigger, psychological trigger, that causes your eyeballs to move from the subject line to the first line. So there would be curiosity, mystique, something that gets you like, that's interesting, and you move your eyeballs to the next line. The next line then talks about the challenge, and then takes you all the way down into life is not good because the challenge is there, and then immediately says, but I can contrast that to a wonderful, happily ever after outcome for you. And then, so that's the emotion. So you go negative and then positive, but then you're like, well, prove it. Your hands are on your hips, prove it to me. So then you go switch to logic and you do a specificity around improvement, percent improvement. This is where all your statistics come in as to how you helped people. And you may throw in there a couple of lines about others before you have done this and they've had this success. And then from there, you just say, here's the opportunity that lies ahead of you, and here's the call to action. So it follows this arc. And it's amazing that you can get all of that into 80 words if you really work at it.
And we'll have a link to Joseph Campbell on his books on the show notes, because that's one of my favorite books, and I'm just sort of thinking about how he would think about us discussing his work in this. And I sometimes put Star Wars memes in my blog posts and whatnot, because it is a lot about the hero's journey, and I usually think about that at the end of the funnel when you're sending a proposal to people. It's still right. It's a story starring the customer.
Yep.
Not you.
It's at the beginning. It's
the same thing at the beginning, right? And so you got 80 words to do it, and you've got to tell a compelling story. That's great. Yeah.
I think of, when you, in the olden days, when you used to rush down the freeway and you saw a billboard and like, whoa, it caught your eye because there was something about the words on that billboard. That's our email. Just like that.
And so again, it goes back to, do you know what's going to be interesting to your prospect?
Right.
Or some percentage of them?
It definitely comes down to belly to belly. You're sitting across the table from your prospect virtually. You're in their shoes. You're talking their talk. You're walking their walk. And it's almost as if you want to have a picture of them as you're writing. Or just think of yourself talking like you and I are talking right now. I'm talking to you. And maybe I have my clients record the conversation when they're talking to their persona into their cell phone, and then we transcribe it, and that becomes the baseline for the most beautiful emails that I've ever seen written. Why? Because you know how to have the conversation. It's just when you get to this thing with this blank piece of paper, you suddenly freak out saying, I can't write, but you can speak. And the emails really need to be more about speaking than they do writing.
That's a great point. And it's funny, I was having this conversation with a prospect earlier today about the challenge of, they've got all these people who are experts in their field, but they can't sell.
Yeah.
But if you put them in a room with somebody, their passion and their brilliance
comes across.
And I'm like, well, we have all these recording devices now.
Yes.
And that's the funny thing, right? No one wants to really be on camera and whatnot. But you can just, like, everyone's cell phone pretty much these days can record audio or video.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And just get it out there, and then you can always edit it using the process you talked about, right? You can run some A/B tests, but if you're stuck, I think that's a wonderful tip. And that so many people go into these meetings that, they finally earn the meeting, and they go in and they wow people with their expertise, but if you ask them to write a sales email, it sounds like the kind of thing that's going to go straight to your spam folder, or you're going to delete it and block them right away because it just sounds so awful.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't have to, because you're speaking your passion. So just turn on your cell phone and then transcribe it. And you have now, instead of a blank piece of paper, you have your words. So much easier to edit after that point.
That's a great point. And especially you can even record a conversation if you've got colleagues. Mm-hmm. People can all add their point of view, and you're right. As soon as you get past that blank sheet of paper, everything gets a lot easier.
A lot easier. And there are free transcription programs too. So I don't want to hear, well, I can't transcribe it. Yes, you can. Even YouTube will transcribe your stuff. If you put it on YouTube, it puts the captions underneath and transcribes it for you.
And hopefully how long should an initial sales email be?
Well, I think it's really, we talked a little bit before about this level of awareness. And so in the book, we talk about if you're at a lower level of awareness, your attention span just naturally is not going to be there. So you have to be cognizant of where you think, especially since we're targeting, remember, we're picking our list. We have to really think about, is this person on average going to be aware of who we are, aware of the problem, aware of the solutions to the problem? So make some stab at where you think they are relative to that level of awareness. And your content then will reflect the length of what you need to do. That's what drives it more than anything else. Because if I'm unaware, I'm only going to have an attention span of maybe 20 seconds. But if I'm very aware, acutely aware, and want to solve this, I am going to look at a longer email.
And that 20 seconds presupposes that the subject line is interesting and the first line of the email, right?
Grabs you.
Otherwise, deletes really fast.
Yes. Someone once told me that 20% of your time is on the body of the email and 80% is on the subject line. So that gives you an idea of how much you need to focus on that trigger, that one trigger to get them to move those eyeballs to the next line.
And that sounds scary, but it's kind of nice because it's a lot easier to test a subject line than an email, right? The body of the email.
Yeah, totally. And, part of we're engineers, so we know the power of habit. Otherwise, we wouldn't be good at our programming or whatever we're doing. So take 10 minutes every day and just write subject lines for 10 minutes. Put your timer on your phone. Just write subject lines. And when 10 minutes are done, you're done. You'll get better and better with writing subject lines if you do that every day.
And I think something that I've tried to train myself to do is to write down what prospects are telling me their problems are, so that when I'm trying to think, gosh, what should this email be about? Well, it's about this problem that I keep hearing about again and again in their words.
Yes. And there's other ways to use the internet to search for how people are searching. I mean, you can actually put in your keyword or your pain point, and there are tools out there that allow you to see how people are actually searching for that particular keyword, what they're saying, the who, what, where, when, why. And that gives you tons of subject line examples.
So there's no excuse not to be able to come up with some great subject lines to at least get you started with your testing.
Correct.
Okay.
And when in doubt, steal. There's like tons of subject lines out there and most of the great writers say that. Steal the greatest, create what they call a swipe file of the ones that are high performing, and that's your go-to when you're stuck.
Right.
Go to that swipe file.
Now, something that I think people struggle with, let's assume that they're following up to this point. What is the appropriate next step for that initial email? Because we're defining the state machine of pipeline stages. And
right.
I think sometimes people get hung up on, they're not ready to buy, and they're trying to convince people to buy with that initial email. What's an appropriate thing to go from, I don't even know who you are, to here's an email. What should I be trying to convince them to do as the next step?
Well, I like a softer approach. So I'm kind of in it for the long haul. So what I like to do is educate first. So my first 3 emails are probably more about first trying to see if they're the right guy, because I like to kind of weed out the people. If I got the wrong person, I want them to tell me that. So I use the standard predictable revenue. Are you the right guy? I think you're the right guy, and here's why. And if they get back to me, then we have a dialogue going. If they don't, then I'm more about educating them on the problems that I think that persona is faced with. And so I drill down on that problem, and I give them content that will help them see where they are relative to the problem severity. And then maybe after the 4th email, if I see, because I can look now to see the analytics, if I'm seeing them open, if I'm seeing them click through, I may suggest that, hey, I noticed that you click through to this document. There is a compelling argument in that document that I think if we can have 5 minutes of conversation around it, let me know, and I'll be happy to schedule time with you. So I really do more of a slow approach to start building rapport, start building trust. And I do not, me personally, request that they stop what they're doing and have 15 minutes with me. I think that's very disrespectful.
So basically, you're not sending them a single email. You're sending them a sequence of emails.
Yes. I send in the book, I give examples of the sequence itself, 2 examples. I typically send between 6 and 8 emails, and depending on my bandwidth, because sometimes I'm pretty busy with a lot of my speeches and stuff, I integrate the telephone into that for follow-up.
Okay. So this notion of I'm sending an email and they didn't respond, or even I'm sending them 3 emails and they haven't responded, it's like you're not actually doing this yet. You have to get up to 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 touches just on the initial outreach.
Correct. And then after that cycle, you incubate, you put them to sleep, you incubate them, and then they come back in again in a 3 to 6 month time frame, depending on how many names you have to contact.
So the key is for people who are trying to do this and maintain their sanity, you have an automated way to send out this sequence. You have to define the sequence up front, but then you can just go send it, and people will kind of raise their hand, talk to me if and when they want to.
Exactly. And you organize the sequence once again with using our engineering background in what you think the pain themes are that will resonate first and foremost, and then work your way down. Now, if some of you have only 2 pain points, then through those 6 to 8 emails, you speak those pain points, but use a different analogy for the pain point over and over again. But you're really trying to focus on that flow, that structure we talked about before of here's the challenge, contrast that to the outcome that they can expect for the happily ever after, prove that point with specificity, suggest the opportunity that's ahead of them, and then ask for a call to action.
And so what is that call to action when you're doing this initial outreach, right? It's probably not give me $1 million or whatever.
It could be something like, click through to this piece of content. It could be something like, reply back to me. Let me know what you think about this. It could be something like, if you have time on the calendar, you think this is of importance to you, let's schedule some time. It very seldom is it by now. It just isn't. But again, it depends on your sales cycle. And part of this back of the napkin thing I was talking to you about is to map out those stages, that conversation, because that conversation will help you decide what types of touches you really need and what the call to action should be.
Okay. So the key thing is to know what the next step for the buyer is, essentially, and not try to get them to marry you on the second date or the first date.
Right. Yes, that's the ideal. But it also means that you're going to be consistently reaching out to people with information that's of value to them and that's going to transform their life. If you are going to hit that send button, before you hit it, if you say to yourself, if you read that email and you ask yourself, is this transforming my prospect's life with this email that I'm sending? If the answer is no, then do not send it. We get enough emails that are of no value.
That's a very good point. I get a lot of those emails from people who are, they're like checking the box. We're prospecting via email.
Yeah. It's not good for us. No. Everything we do should add value, meaning there should be something that I send to you that's going to make your day or, just get you thinking, wow, I never thought of it that way. And if you don't have those things, then you need to go back to the drawing board and figure out why people should change, why now, and why you. If you can't come up with that, you're in the wrong biz.
Right. So the very first email that goes out, what's the call to action on that? And I know it's going to depend based on what you're selling, but is it, is there an explicit click here or do something, or is it just basically get ready for my next email?
I like to still bumper, what I call bumper, with the predictable revenue emails, which says, hey, are you the right guy to have this conversation around this fabulous thing that I want to talk about? So it's looking for the internal referral. So I'm looking for a reply back, usually on my first email. And then in the second email, I bumper that with an in-thread reply, but I also send them a click-through to a frequently asked questions or should ask questions or a one-page infographic or a one-page case study wireframe or something of value. And I don't ask necessarily for a reply back, but I tell them, hey, this is something that you may want to consider. Because I noticed when I did research on your company that this initiative is becoming important to your CEO. So there's a little bit of research that's done in there. And you're really just giving them the ammunition they need to feel good in their heart that they can have a conversation with you.
Okay. And you raised a great point about, do I know what the priorities of the CEO are or whatever it is, that obviously involves some research. So how much of this is, I'll try to ask a long question so you can actually have a couple of sips of wine. I feel like it's not fair because you're dropping wisdom and I'm sitting here like, oh, this is a lovely way to spend an afternoon making you work. Obviously, there's sort of a trade-off between specificity and research and personalization and scalability. And it's going to depend a little bit on what your business is, where you draw that, where you optimize. But are there rules of thumb that can help you understand whether you're doing a reasonable job at that?
I like to once again go back to our math and look at the number of records where we are positionally in the pipeline. So if I'm in the cold queue where I'm doing that initial outreach, I'm going to leverage data as much as possible to have these conversations while I'm sleeping, so to speak. So I'm not going to personalize very heavily until I get someone to raise a pinky or a hand or reply back saying, come on in, so I can move them to working status. In working status, which is that next logical position in the pipeline, I should only be working 20 to 40 accounts at that point in time. So there, I can personalize because 20 accounts I should be able to personalize, at least get to the point where I've done some research the night before. I go home, I kind of go to sleep, and it subconsciously works its way up to allow me to be able to position that argument or whatever. And I say argument meaning the sales conversation. And then I come in, I work my queue from top to bottom of those 20. I've already done my research, so I just start plugging in my value proposition from the template that I have, make the specificity of the personalization in the first paragraph or the click-through or wherever I'm putting it, and send that thing off. So it makes it a lot easier. The smaller number of records you have to work, the more personalization you should put in. If you have a lot of records, then leverage technology and mass personalization to do that work for you.
I think that's a great tip. So basically, when I do the initial outreach, it's all basically merge fields and data integration.
Yes. Yes.
But I've targeted it finally enough that everyone who gets that, it should have some resonance with them.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. And if you build those queues by persona, then you may have two sequences, one for the IT, for example, and one for the marketing, but you're using their language in the body of the email, but you're leveraging technology to have a mass personalization. So basically you're allowing the systems to have the people bubble up to the top and self-select who are going to go into that working status, where you are going to start more personalization and add more human resource to that conversation, because they've positionally moved from, the larger number of records into the smaller number of records.
Got it. Okay. So basically you have to do a bunch of upfront work for your outbound. You're going to define 6, 8, maybe even more emails, but it's all automated.
Yes, and your content assets are already included. So you build a matrix, and there's one in the book to show you, essentially, the 6 touches, the pain themes, the touch days, and you have this sort of calendar thing going where you've put that all together, and then you turn on the switch, essentially, and get them running. And then you put a statistically relevant number of records through that, so that once you pass through all 8 or 6, you then say, okay, I'm putting these guys to sleep. I'm going to look at the results of that sequence, and there are going to be those red spots that I want to definitely optimize, and I'll leave the rest alone for the next time.
And you probably have more data on this than I do, but there's all these studies that say, people don't buy until the 9th touch or something like that I think and the average salesperson gives up after the 3rd or something like that, right? There's something about persistence that, as much as we think it's weird, is really important. And I think one of the things that's hard is people kind of get stuck in this no man's land where they're not really automated and they're not really personalized. And they're trying, I know I went through this phase where I'm like trying to stay on top of however many people are sort of quasi in my funnel. And what you're saying is, let's invest the time up front to understand our market, lay out our sequence, send it, and I can do that. That can happen while I'm sleeping, literally, as you were saying. But then I'm only talking to the people who actually have some interest.
Right.
And it's worth it for me to go in and invest the time to understand what they're talking about. And I already know, based on my funnel, what constitutes a viable opportunity and what I think a reasonable next step is. So if somebody doesn't meet that, I don't have to make an emotional decision about whether they should stay in the funnel.
Exactly. And, we know as engineers that the planning process is so important, because we work through in our subconscious what could go wrong, and we plan for that.
Right.
So when we hit the execution button, there are always going to be surprises, but for the most part, we're ready to kind of fine tune and tweak and get it to go. So we need to use our engineering know-how of process design, of just design specifications in general for the pipeline, because it's definitely starts that way.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's like we think of it as this totally different domain that somehow our skills don't apply to.
Right.
And I'm not saying we don't have things to learn, because at least I had a tremendous number of things to learn. I still do, but the fundamental notion of there is a process that we can optimize,
Right.
I think is absolutely true. And I think a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about, some really concrete tips about here's how you can do this and don't do that and so on and so forth, really helpful. And I wouldn't say I have it at the level you do, but I feel like a lot of the stuff you're talking about, I spent over a decade learning the hard way.
Mm-hmm.
And you say it now, and I'm like, yeah, totally, whatever. Like, if you had said this to me 15 years ago, I would have been like, oh, really? I should do that? Right? And the whole point of this podcast is to spare people the pain that I've gone through. So I really appreciate a lot of these specific tips, and I hope people out there who are listening can say, yeah, this is something that I can take on. It doesn't have to be MasterCard or Apple or some of your really big name clients. This is something that's feasible for me to do because I know what my customers care about.
Right. And I have clients now that are real estate agents that have found that the book, even though it says B2B on it, that have found the book helpful in prospecting, financial what are they, FAs, financial advisors. So there's people that are coming out of the woodwork that are seeing the value of a process. And it's just, if you can draw it on the back of your napkin, draw your pipeline, draw your workflow through the pipeline, draw the arrows of leads coming in, where they're coming from, how they're sourced, and, you can get it all on a piece of paper. Then you just have to chunk it down into those logical components that it's almost like playing the Monopoly game. What is going to cause me to collect $200 and then go to the next stage, and that's really what the pipeline is in a lot of ways.
And I think the other side of it is I have the same problem you were talking about earlier, where it's like I talk to these people and emotionally I connect with them, even if they're not good prospects.
Yeah.
And I don't want to tell them to take a hike, even if I kind of know in my gut that this is not a good opportunity. I'm like, oh, they're so nice, and I really wish I could help them, and blah 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 blah. And it's like, in addition to getting people through to the end and closing good prospects, I need an easy way for myself to say, hey, what would be a better fit for you? X or Y or Z. Or what you should do before you come back and talk to me? Something. Right. And whether or not they come back and talk, but it's like I'm not breaking up with them. Mm-hmm. I have an established process that I know for me has been probably as helpful as sort of the positive side. It's like getting rid of the negative side so that my head isn't cluttered with that, and I can just focus on what's actually going to turn into business. Exactly.
Yeah, it's hard for us. Like I said, we love everybody, but there has to be your minimally acceptable. You have to have that scale of, good, better, best. And if they're definitely falling below the good, then have a nice nurture sequence that you can send them to educate themselves and let them come back into you and reach out to you again. So you're still providing value, but when they're ready or they meet the right requirements, you got to let them go. You got to let them go.
You don't have to just kick them to the curb. You can nurture them.
Yes,
and
you can always nurture.
Invest a ton of time to do that.
Right. Exactly.
So when people get to the meeting, obviously there isn't any ironclad rule that they're going to turn into customers.
Right.
There's still a whole other the bottom of the funnel sales process that has to go on. What can we do other than, obviously it's helpful to say, here's our ideal customer profile, et cetera, but are there other things that we can do during our prospecting phase to kind of set ourselves up for better success when we actually get the meeting?
Well, there's a whole aspect of listening skills and questioning related to disqualification is one area that I really focus my clients on, so that whatever your narrow focus is, whether you want them to want a decision in the next 6 months, 3 months, a year, whatever it is. So there's certain parameters that you're going to feel good about in terms of taking them the rest of the way. So you need to ask questions for that. So I actually develop question trees with clients so that we make sure we're covering those areas that give us that smooth transition from opportunity to close. So the next place I would spend my time on is good listening skills. And when I say that, I don't mean thinking as you're talking to them what your next question is going to be, but more listening to them and allow pause to happen. and really connect with them that way. Because then if they don't meet your requirements, they're going to feel so connected to you that when they're ready, they'll come back.
And I think that's another area where the sort of the introverted engineer archetype can actually do really well. Really well.
We're just wired for that because we don't necessarily attach our success to the outcome. We're more about in the moment. So that's good. That serves us in terms of making sure that we've got all the right qualifications for this person and that we truly know in our heart that we can help them.
And this is going to be a dumb question, and I think I can kind of guess what question trees are, but tell me specifically what a question tree is.
Well, for me, it's teaching the spin selling methodology from Neil Rackham. So it's the situational, problem, implication, and need questions, like what's the N? I usually use the I mostly. I don't really use any of the other three, but it's taking those implication questions, and again, we're looking at that level of awareness to see where this prospect is on the spectrum of awareness. Because last thing we want to do is spend time trying to convince somebody who's in this unaware, problem-aware state that they need this thing. We want to be able to convince them, but if we want also to be able to put through our pipeline those people who are going to help us reduce that lag, which means they're going to be sense of urgency, more interested. So we ask questions along the question tree behaviorally and also to sort of a little bit agitate, nudge, interrupt them a bit so that they're thinking outside the box.
And by question tree, are there sort of branches on this tree depending on what they answered before?
Yes. In fact, I'll put in the show notes a problem, a pain point that generally my marketing people have, and then all the different ways that pain point, it's the 5 whys basically, how it actually comes down to the root cause of the problem. It's not that they can't generate leads, it's that all these other things are happening. And also to understand behaviorally where they are relative to wanting to make that change.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it also is very helpful if you're struggling with what we said before, like you're trying to think of what to say next instead of really listening.
Right.
You don't have to think about that anymore if you've got your question tree.
Right. And I, being who I am, I had in my office for a very long time those poster boards just filled with question trees all around my office because I like to memorize the actual dance, if you will, the actual conversation. Because I'm not a natural communicator, I wanted to be able to rehearse and practice and role play. So I did that a lot, and I still do that.
That's
to this day.
A great tip. I used to have sticky notes on my monitor.
Okay.
I've gotten away from that, but it's kind of nice just to have a physical, in this day of smartphones and cloud software and whatnot. It's nice sometimes just to have a physical thing that you can stare at, and it's always there and it's always on. And I think it kind of, again, going back to Sales for Nerds, a lot of these questions, it's not like, hey, am I doing this to trick you into something so I can make my quota? It's, let me really make sure I'm understanding this problem and I care deeply about solving your problem, and it feels so natural.
Right. It's like we're doctors, we're trying to diagnose the problem. There could be a myriad of things that are wrong, but we really want to get to the root of the problem. And essentially that's what the question tree helps us do, is pre-think what the root could be.
Right.
So it's lodged in our subconscious so that when we start hearing things and listening and hearing these keywords or phrases, we kind of get the gist of where to go next. We're not thinking ahead of what the question would be. We're more internalizing, okay, this is where this person is leading, so I have a number of options that I can go with next. It's just a way to preempt and have you feel comfortable that you've really thought through the various scenarios of what could be happening.
That makes a lot of sense. So I know I've kept you longer than I'm supposed to, but I'm really enjoying this. And I'm not even sure you've got to your sangria yet. But if I can recap, it's figure out who you're trying to sell to, what's your ideal customer profile, what do they care about, set up a sequence to go address them. Send that out on autopilot, and if you've got some A/B testing built in, great. Otherwise, you could do some A/B testing manually. And then when people raise their hands and say, hey, I'm interested in hearing more, or they just respond or whatever, you've got sort of a much smaller number of people that you can work with more one-to-one. But you do that within a context of a defined process so that you still have control over whether someone advances or not and how much time you invest in them.
Exactly. And it's all about, there's a formula on page 42 of predictable revenue, which says predictable revenue is the actual pipeline, the average deal size, and time. Time is one of those parameters that we often forget, but we want to be able to maximize our return on effort, our human time, but also add value. So we have to weigh technology versus human in this process as well.
Right. And it also makes a big difference whether a deal closes next month because someone's a hot prospect, or whether it closes 15 months from now,
right? Because
they have a good profile, but they have another set of priorities for the next year.
Right. So it's always a good idea to keep the prospecting going, and it's a habit that you want to do regularly so that you're not doing this peak and valley roller coaster thing. That is the biggest stressor for most of our, people listening to the call who do prospecting.
Yes.
Yeah.
You feel good some days, and then you had this great conversation, and you just feel good, right? And then other days, no one picks up the phone or no one responds, and you feel terrible. But you're right. It's not about you personally. It's about the process.
Exactly. Habit trumps inspiration for top of funnel for sure.
Okay, love it. That's a great phrase. So, anything else that people should know about? I feel like we've covered a lot of territory, but I want to. Yeah. You have gone from writing operating system software to writing your own sales software to being a sales author superstar. And I'm kind of like, I'm not trying to take anything away from what you've done, but I'm like, if you can go from here to here across the Grand Canyon, surely most of us mortals can go from here to here, right? We can go across the little river or something.
Yeah. You just rely on your process know-how, and you're definitely 1/3 of the way there. And then work on the questioning and the dialogue, the sales conversation itself, and how to present yourself and your solutions in a way that's respectful and that your personality comes out, and you'll be fine.
Well, Marylou, thanks so much for the time. Maybe someday we'll do this in person and I can actually bring you some wine.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.